Hello, everybody. Happy Thursday. This is
Yes,
going to be an interesting show, I can already tell you.
happy Thursday. Yeah, the technical difficulties pre Green Room were significant. So I don't know what's going on with the stars and the cosmos and all the bits flying throughout the internet, but we're here and yeah. So episode 51 of Cloud Foundry Weekly. The title of the show is "I Ain't Afraid of No CVEs,"
I
and
ain't
then
afraid of
that
no
is
CVEs.
yeah, right. I thought that was a good one. And
Yep.
that's this is if you haven't picked up on it yet, this is another into the DMZ series. So our friend DMZ will be joining us again, and we have Nishad as well, and potentially Rajan too. So we're uh we're having a multi guest situation in StreamYard's a little. We'll figure it out. But
Yep.
any pre show banter, Nikki? Any what's going on in your neck of the woods this week?
Well, first and foremost, lovely background. I'm doing this live from a hotel.
Very
So
nice.
at SRE Con in Santa Clara this week. This SRE Con, absolutely one of the most fun conferences I've ever been to. Why, you ask? I'm just going to go ahead and have you ask,
Yes.
ask the question
Why?
for you. Why, you
Why?
ask? Because this conference is all about tech talk. It really is. It's, you go to conferences, you tend to get those people that come in, the swag goblins that want to just want to come in and get the t-shirts. That is not the case here, man. It is people are coming up. Hey, we're almost having to make people take swag at this conference. They're like, no, I got problems. I need you to help me. Every booth, we're getting the same thing. It is good talks, a lot of good conversation. So next year, if you haven't gone to SRE Con, you need to. Absolutely. And then other than that, I got 99 problems, but a CVE ain't one. So
Yeah. Oh, that would have even been a better title. Yeah. So I forgot about your swag goblin commentary, and so
uh,
true.
yeah, yeah.
My pre-show banter will just be a shameless plug for the Cloud Foundry Day North America, as we're talking conferences coming up in 6 weeks, 5 days, 10 hours, 53 minutes, and 20 seconds. So yeah, you should
Do you
check that
do
out.
you legit have a countdown on your computer?
No, the web page has a countdown on
Oh,
it.
the
So I
web
literally
page.
pulled
All
up the
right.
web page on the side, and I was like, "Oh, it's a perfect opportunity to read the countdown and not be totally weird." All right, cool. So yes, with that
Just
out
to
of the
say,
way,
Nick, you're taking excitement to a whole new level if you've actually got a countdown. But I forgot about the
yeah,
web page. My bad. All right.
yeah. It worked out. Well, I guess we should bring our guest on. How do you feel about that? Yeah.
Yeah,
Or
we're
do you
gonna
have
save
any?
DMZ for last. Everybody knows DMZ, so let's
Yeah,
let's
yeah, yeah.
let's start with the new guys.
Hello. Hi, I'm
Hi,
Hello,
Nishad.
Nishad. Hi. Introduce yourself
welcome.
before we bring DMZ on.
Oh, hi, Nishad. I don't know. I work on some security things at Tanzu. Lot of fun.
Work on some security things.
Yeah, I mean,
Very
I don't
nice.
know.
Works for me.
Security things and
Yep.
other things, to be
Yeah,
honest. My job is to do whatever somebody tells me to do. Lots of fun.
yeah, yeah.
It's like you're in the
But
military.
security is a big part of that right
Mm. All right. And of
now. I don't
course,
think I
Mr.
last
DMZ.
5 seconds in the military.
Yeah.
Well, you'd have to get that haircut. You'd have to look like me, and nobody wants that. And Nick.
Unless he goes in the Air Force. I think the Air Force has a longer hair ratio.
I was in the Air Force. I never saw that, so I don't know if that's true.
I don't know. I
How
wasn't
you
either.
doing, DMZ?
Actually, pretty good. I think yeah. Conferences are kind of what inspired a lot of today's conversation. In fact, I reached out to Nick. I think last week or week before, and said, "Hey, I'm going to be speaking at B-Side Charlotte because I am actually working out of the Charlotte office for Broadcom these days, which is next weekend. So I don't need to
Nice.
stay in a hotel. I actually have a place in Charlotte I can stay in, and that's actually kind of inspired the topic of today's conversation. It's an '80s themed conference where they've asked every speaker to do something around an '80s theme, and I decided to go with Ghostbusters because I ain't afraid of no CVEs because CVE conversations are part of the ecosystem of security. And it tends to be a sky is falling conversation, and I hope to help level set that. That's my goal in the next year. Is now that we have a much better story around all the work in Nishad, and hopefully Rajan can show up. We can talk about some of the work we've been doing on the back end of trying to
Right.
understand the complexities of vulnerabilities. And the next year is really trying to get a messaging figured out. How do we actually help the industry and the world think about CVEs not as a panic fire drill, but more as a just something that happens, we do a proper risk analysis. We look at the big state of things, because it's not like we're all just like running one app now. We're all running these massive, complex platforms, and the CVE is really a bit more complex than it used to be. So yeah, conferences are starting our whole day today.
It's nice. Are you going to dress up? Are you going to wear you're going to go get the Ghostbusters costume?
I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about getting a slime shooter so I could actually slime the room, but I'm not sure how energetic I feel for that. So I'm spending more of my time. What I've decided to do, and for those, I had screenshots on my computer, but as you can tell, my core kind of small screen on my cell phone, because we had some technical problems. But I'm doing my presentation based upon the 1984 Commodore 64 Ghostbusters game. So
nice.
It's going to be a lot of fun. While the original game was based around Manhattan, I'm going to use that concept as describing a foundation or a cluster. And then I'll use all 5 boroughs to really show a multi-cluster arrangement with these sewers and bridges connecting them all, of the various microservice and mesh connections between services. And we will have Slimer coming in and around. We'll have, the battle with Zool at the end. The 0 day will end up being like, this recent Tomcat issue that came up, and we'll use that as the 0 day that'll be the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man going around, jamming around everybody's little microservices. So it's gonna be a lot of fun. I'm not sure if I have enough energy or time to do the whole costume thing, but we'll see what happens the next week.
I'm going to vote for the costume. Maybe not the slime thing. That might irritate some people, but I think you got to come in wearing it. Yeah.
I'll see what Amazon finds for you.
Are you going to be recording
the
this
ghost
talk?
trap?
Yeah, it'll be recorded. Most B-sides around the globe do record, unless you actually specifically ask them not to. But yeah, this will be recorded. And we've already been talking to Rita and some of our marketing folks about how we can turn that into a broader conversation, because it is going to be lighthearted. It'll be kind of fun, but it's a serious topic that people get really caught up on the nuance of details without really allowing time to deal with the real security issues around it.
Yeah. Well, make sure you get us the link for the meetup. We'll put that in the show notes so that everybody can see it. And then when you get the actual link for the recording, when it gets posted, let us know. We'll link to that as well in the show notes so people can follow along. It sounds like a hella interesting concept. I wish I was going to Charlotte to watch this.
Well, B-Sides itself, if anyone has an opportunity, I've been involved with B-Sides since the second one in Las Vegas, where it started. And it's just an incredible global organization. It tends to be very community-based. So there's one here in Charlotte, there's Asheville, there's San Francisco, there's Las Vegas, there's New York, there's down in Charleston, which I helped found the one in Charleston. But they're all around the globe. If you're anywhere around the globe, any week of every month, there's going to be a B-side somewhere. Sometimes they rent a room out on the back of a bar. Sometimes they're big enough with a couple hundred people, they actually get a whole conference facility. So depending on the size of the community, it's a lot of fun. It really helps you get around to your local community, build some networking, and just have fun just talking about security. We used to have a guy in their Charleston one who would bring an ATM machine every year and actually allow you to pick the lock or try to break into the ATM machine, and he left money in it. Mm-hmm. It was one of his live ATMs. He'd unplug it and bring it in for the weekend and said, if you could break into it, you can have the cash. So it tends to be a very fun set of communities. So there's usually a table set up for lockpicking, so you can actually learn to lockpick, and there's actually a challenge. If it's the people I think it'll be there, they have a really cool, it's actually like a tic-tac-toe challenge where you can pick your lock, and that gets you the X or O, and then the other person can try to pick the lock to block you, but if they don't pick it, then you can, they can actually fail to get their X or O. So it's actually tic-tac-toe, but with lockpicking, so it's kind of cool.
Nice. I see you going in as Vinkman. Are you bringing in Nishad? I'm going to go as Dr. Stantz. Nishad's coming in as Dr. Stantz. You're Vinkman. Am I right?
Actually, as you know, we don't get a large budget for travel, so in spirit they'll all be there. But yep. I hadn't. I think Nishad, you're a little bit further away to get to Charlotte over the weekend, so I'll have you there in spirit somehow.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, you were talking about the 0 day.
In spirit is very thematically appropriate.
Yeah, there you go. That was good one. So you're talking about the 0 day. Tell us more about the 0 day.
Well, it wasn't really a 0 day. It was more of a discovered 9.8 CVE on Tomcat, which, as you know, Tomcat is used in a lot of things, and Cloud Foundry is one of the places that uses Tomcat. And one of the things that Nishad has been helping enormously with, and as soon as you get down here, he also has been helping a lot with it, is really looking at the complexity of how do we do security analysis of a product like Cloud Foundry. How do you really break it down? Everyone's talking SBOMs. I'm sure we've mentioned SBOMs, I think, in prior episodes. Do you have an SBOM that's like a Cloud Foundry SBOM, which would be a massive, massive thing? Or do you do it by individual component? How do they relate together? And one of the things that came up is we're like, oh my gosh, there's a Tomcat issue. Instead of just like, in the past, what we do is we would just go to each product team and say, okay, UAA, Cred Hub, every different team would say, hey, are you using Tomcat? It would be a very cumbersome effort of trying to track that down. And Nishad, if you can just add a little context, I said, hey, can you do a quick search in our vulnerability system? We have a Tanzu vulnerability system that Nishad and Rajan have put together that I love. I will rave about it forever and ever. It's one of my favorite things right now. But it is helped enormously. So Nishad, maybe you can just kind of describe, I asked you, hey, where do we have this? So you kind of ran a query and helped us with that conversation, right?
Yeah, basically at the heart of all of this is the whole Tanzu vulnerability stuff it's basically two things. It's all SBOMs everywhere. And a bunch of metadata, which basically describes how all of this fits together. Like if you look at Tanzu's application service and all this, it's not one SBOM. It's actually like across all, like the whole suite is something like more than like 500-600, probably a few hundred SBOMs put together. And that's just for one release of it. And you've got hundreds, probably like hundreds of thousands of different releases which you have to put together, or not 100,000, but like a lot of different releases you put together. So basically, all we did is just like have it because we've indexed all this, we've got scans for every single version of the product at this point. We basically get, hey, here, let's just go look and see what's here. Like we just look through the whole system, we go search every single SBOM and go find where does Tomcat show up? And we can do it. Like it gives us a giant inventory. It says they're vulnerable.
I think
if they are, don't do it. Sorry, I don't know my audio. Is my audio cutting out?
We lost you for half a second there, but yeah, in the end, Nishad got me a list or we had a big thread going. Like any instant response, you have a big thread of everyone involved in it. And got us a list of the different product components, and as well as our other products. We have other Tanzu products that are also in the same system. So it wasn't just Cloud Foundry, it was across all of our Tanzu products. And then we were able to go to each team and say, okay, the conditions of this vulnerability in Tomcat required certain things. One, you had to have the default servlet installed and running. And two, you actually have to intentionally disable read-only mode. So by default, it gets deployed in read-only mode. And if you intentionally turn off that, then it enables the exploit to happen. It's a deserialization attack where it actually allows you to write to the default servlet. And naturally, once you can write to a remote area, you can start doing remote exploits. So we were then able to go to each of those individual teams and say, one, how are you using Tomcat? And two, does it have this condition? And we went through each individual product team and we were able to actually identify that we didn't, in any instance in our environment, use Tomcat in a way that made it vulnerable. So even if you saw it on a scan, which Nishad, if you search right now for that CVE, you'd see it. The CVE is there. But in reality, it's a false positive because we are not vulnerable because we don't meet the conditions of that. So we were able to, within a couple of hours, examine not just the current release, but prior releases of the product and determine that every version of the Tanzu Cloud Foundry product didn't have any exploitable versions of Tomcat. And that allowed us to actually make that public statement and go to our customers and say, you're not worried, we don't have to worry about this one vulnerability. Here's the reason why across all the product lines. So it was extremely helpful and allowed us to rapidly answer that question.
And I think there's something interesting there. We've talked about this
one
in the
nice thing
past,
is we
David,
can do this even before the scanners pick it up. So like,
no, go ahead.
Go
Nishad.
ahead. Keep going, Nishad. I'll bring my point up here.
No, sorry. Sorry, it just is lagging a little bit. No, it's just like one thing I found really interesting about this whole thing is just because we have all this data, like we have so much visibility into what we ship and sell, that like we can actually go into we can do this before scanners or any commercial partner is even ready to do it yet. Like presumably some of them are doing it, but we can do it like right from the beginning. It's really nice being able to do that, like just knowing exactly what you ship at all times.
So you're saying that before a CVE, before a security scanning tool updates their CVE definitions, you've already seen the CVE pop up and already scan the the payload per se,
Yeah.
right? Internally.
Like in theory, if like we got early disclosure for a vulnerability, we could easily search for it long before it even shows up in any scanners.
Ah, that's pretty cool.
And I think that goes back to a point. We've talked about this before, David. You know, everybody wants SBOMs. Hey, do you provide SBOMs? I need SBOMs, but nobody is really doing things with SBOMs. Here's a good example of where we are doing something with SBOMs. This is where SBOMs become important. You can't just have SBOMs. You got to do something with the SBOMs. And I love the fact that this is something that VMware is going in and they're kind of being proactive to say, okay, we're using our SBOM definitions to be able to proactively tell our customers, hey, there's a early exploit coming out. You are or you aren't, you know, affected by this. And that's a lesson that needs to be taken throughout security, throughout, you know, dev teams and SRE teams to say, yes, get your SBOMs, but figure out how you're going to use your SBOMs.
Well, even that, we're still kind of figuring some things out, you know, as we go, because we're learning more and more things. Like we're learning a certain set of metadata is not there, and we want to add more to it. As Nishad mentioned, that metadata is what ties it together. I think that's what's missing a lot in the SBOM conversation. Like the federal mandate says you must do it. And then you have all these commercial companies like, that's a good idea. We like that too. So they start adding to their contracts. We need to have SBOMs on request. But just having an
Right.
SBOM doesn't tell you where's it used, how is it built. That metadata is so critical. So I can see as we start having SBOMs to customers, there's going to need to be a context that goes with it. We're going to need to find a way of actually helping describe how it goes together. In Broadcom, we have an SBOM requirement that includes dependency mapping and graph diagrams and those sort of things. But realistically, on a very complex system like Cloud Foundry or Tanzu platform, any of these systems that have hundreds of microservices that might run within a variety of either VMs or containers, it gets very complex when you start mapping that together. It makes it so that relationship is tied to what that vulnerability is. In fact, if you look at the CVEs calculator, there is how complex is the attack, and that's one thing we did on the Tomcat attack is we did a modified CVEs score for the Tanzu platform where it came out as I think it was a 9.4 originally, and with our recalculation of the score, it came out to a 7.8 because we said it's not this easy to have. Like this, if Tomcat was publicly available on the internet, had these constraints in place, and you could exploit it, it's super easy. But because most businesses that can use Cloud Foundry, they're doing it on a private network. You know, I can't think of a bank that would put Cloud Foundry on the internet. Like they would have the ingress, the apps on the internet, but the actual platform itself is not going to be. They're going to have some sort of controls around it. They have monitoring. So it's a bit more highly complex in getting to exploit that. And by changing those environmental settings that come to a Cloud Foundry environment, we actually got the actual calculated score down to 7.8, which is still high. But with that in mind of our own constraints, it just helped, you know, add the context of when someone sees it from Tanzu, they're saying, we see this vulnerability, we're concerned about it, what's the risk? We come back with our answer, well, we've identified this, not really as risky as the original one says because of the reason of the way the platform works, but also here's the context of everywhere we use it and how it fits together. It gets back to what I was saying earlier, that we spend so much time trying to upgrade vulnerabilities and worry about vulnerabilities that we can't even get to the point of what is the risk of just the platform itself. And that's what I'm hoping we can start doing is as we get to a point where we can actually just have a constant above the board conversation. Here's the vulnerabilities, here's the risks of the vulnerabilities. Let's just push it off to the side, handle that through automatic upgrades. Now let's look at what is the risk of running this platform? What is the risk of the applications that we can then have a real serious conversation about how to do better security.
When you start getting into this and you start looking at, because you're absolutely correct, you look at a big platform, you start looking at, you know, the SBOMs and all the relations, you start getting this picture that resembles something like a beautiful mind, right? There's just stuff everywhere and it's just all interconnected. So, you know, your key statement there was what's important to us is that metadata behind it. So educate me, if not everybody else, are there standards boards looking at this about, hey, what metadata should be included, what shouldn't, so that you can start making sense of some of this stuff?
It's hard to answer that. There, yes and no. So yes, there is some conversations around that. I think the trends I'm seeing a lot, and this is not everything in the industry. I'm not an expert on everybody doing everything, but the stuff I've seen out there, it tends to be very small focus. Like, you know, you're doing one app, you're doing one thing here. It's not the big platform type of thing. If you're like in Amazon or, you know, a vSphere or Tanzu space where you have these big platforms, worth considering that. But most people are developing and looking at individual services. Like Nishad, if you haven't, let's talk about our metadata a little bit. So if we have metadata that goes to a build. So if you think of, we have the Cloud Foundry, the product metadata, which then we have a bunch of builds that go with each component. So each component might have, so you might have like 10.0.3, which just came out. That's going to have, as Nishad mentioned, we're going to have maybe 150 other SBOM for other components that go into that. Each one of those might have 5 to 10 different builds before the next release. And each one of those builds has their own SBOM, that has their own CVE story, but also there's metadata for that build and the product itself. So maybe Nishad, you can talk about the things we look at in that metadata and how it ties together. And we're still maturing that as well. We're still in the early stages of that. Nishad, you want to talk about metadata a little?
Sure. And sorry, I may have missed just what you were saying right at the end, because at least for me, your video cut out for a second.
Yeah, I was just talking about how we've started. We're still in the early stages of the metadata. So we have metadata on the product itself, and there's a lot of builds and components that go into it, and they each have their own metadata. And maybe you can just kind of talk a little bit about the way, what sort of things we look at in metadata, what's important to us at a high level, and how we made the decisions.
So, yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting. So a lot of the metadata, like the perspective we've taken, or the approach we've taken to this right now, something that'll change over time, is right now the way we approach this, we basically approach this from like a build down perspective. So like you'll say like Tanzu Tanzu platform as it ships today it's a lot of small services, which this is a lot of this internal detail, so it's like leak a little bit there. But it's like there's like this bundle of services inside there, these images inside these and next to it are these other bundles of services which have more bundles of services under them with more images. And it's just like this, like what it actually ends up all looking like at the end of the day is actually this. It's what is effectively a directed acyclic graph of dependencies. It's not quite, I wouldn't quite call it a tree, but it's very close to that, where you basically have a set of dependencies which depends on things, which have like, eventually you like reach these leaf nodes. And those leaf nodes are the things that actually have scans, metadata, and you have like, and then one of the interesting things is like, you might have 10 different versions, but doesn't mean you have 10, like each version is completely different. Like some of them share bits and pieces, some of the vulnerabilities are shared. Like when you're doing triage, which is actually one of the hardest parts of this whole process, like how do you make it scalable? Like you don't want to triage the same thing, and like just because you have 10 versions of Tanzu platform, you might only ship one thing with this. Like you want it, like you need to know that, hey, we reuse this in 10 different things. Like
froze again.
Yeah.
I
didn't know if it was me. It's the internet. We'll blame today has got there's somebody afraid of CVEs somewhere, so we're having troubles with that.
Yeah. Our stream's getting DDoSed. Yeah.
And it's always fun because you get that when you pause the TV, you always get the worst look on somebody's face. And I'm gonna start taking screenshots in Nishad when he pauses. So, David, to your point, right? You said, well, most companies aren't going to have that complex, and I agree with that. But I also kind of look at this as each application and dev team. A lot of them are kind of like little mini platforms within themselves, right? That's one of the points of microservices is breaking an application up. So you might have 3 or 4 microservices; those are all interconnected. I get what you're saying. The SBOM, trying to break those out is not going to be as complex as it is for something like Cloud Foundry or Tanzu platform, but they're still going to have those interconnects. And I think this would be a good case study to write out to show companies how we do it and how they might be able to do it as well. And I say we. I'm not.
You're still here in spirit. You're still here in spirit. So we were there with you. But we're actually. It is very hard habit, yeah. It is something though that we are working on. How do we actually articulate this? And that's why I'm having fun with the conference next week. Is how do we actually? It's such a complex message, and how do we get this in a way that's it's not overwhelmingly complex, but easily understood by different levels of people. So we will be working on white papers or presentations or things around that. But I will say that our biggest customers, the banks, the governments, they are writing very massive multi microservice applications that their applications will have some very interesting SBOMs. Now, if what gets really interesting in this conversation is when they're running those applications on Cloud Foundry, and you think about, well, their SBOM is their application code and the dependencies they pulled in, but it's also the stack and build pack that they got from us, which runs on top of the tile that includes the stack on the Diego cell. And it's like this overall, it's not just the SBOM for all the components, but as you get to the place where it runs the applications, we're not fully virtualized. These are just namespace segmented processes running. So there's this overlap of, well, can you escape the container? Well, luckily in Cloud Foundry, you have to intentionally turn on privilege mode, which is generally needed to escape a container. But on its own, it's just a process. It has some constraints on it, but then that process is built and running on parts of the, like we have an SBOM for the build pack, we have an SBOM for the stack, then they have their SBOM for their application, which includes their dependencies. How it's not just a matter of having the different SBOMs, but how do they overlap? And so I was saying that overlap, and there's different pieces together. And I think there's one thing you mentioned that we kind of glossed over is the triage step. The whole reason we've really been doing this is we need to be able to communicate to customers what are the vulnerabilities, but two, what's the status of that? So, we're doing regular bumping upgrades. Stem cells are releasing every couple of weeks. There's always going to be upgrades happening. It's going to automatically triage and say this CVE is patched in this release in these versions. But there's that conversation of that middle ground. There's things before they're patched. What's the relationship around that? And then you start adding on top of that customer's application that's built from our build packs and running on our stack. How does that overlap look? How do you deal with the vulnerabilities in that part of this of the different SBOMs and stack there? Because we have some metadata, but the relationship is that's going into their space and their dependencies and the way their own application works. So they're going to depend upon our information to build a set of building blocks, but then go from that into their space on their applications. And while they're still struggling, the biggest companies actually, when we've met with a couple of customers, because we're working on how do we actually get this data to customers in a lot of ways. We have a lot of threads working on that. One team, it's a fairly large bank, they're a global bank, and they were like, hey, we love the idea of this, but can you get us in a Cyclone DX? And we're like, yes, because our tool exports and manages Cyclone DX. It's not a problem. But there are nuances that we've discovered in working with different Cyclone DX receiving customers is not every Cyclone DX customer looks at the format the same way. So we're discovering that even the SBOM community, the same standard doesn't necessarily mean that someone can consume it. And the tools the industry is making doesn't necessarily consume that data. So we're working through, not only is it a massive amount of data and massively overlapping, but it doesn't necessarily line up easily with the tools customers might have. So there's all this integration question too. I'm not sure if Nishad is still here, if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I think at one point we had more than 6. You did 2 things that were interesting. It's there's ostensibly standards for vulnerability, SPDA, et cetera, but they really are such loose standards that it's very difficult for everyone to work with. It's kind of interesting. It's one of those problems I think people will need to address in the long term. Is this idea of how do we get a real standard, not just a pseudo standard that everyone implements a different part of? And you might have send the same data to 3 different people, and they want it in 3 slightly different forms. It's like CSVs. CSVs are technically standardized, but not really. And yeah, it's kind of interesting. And the other half of this is and there's also just huge amounts of data. I think at one point I did the math, and we had more than 600,000 scans in our system. It's just huge volumes of data, because it's also just a moving target. It's just, you don't stop scanning. Every day you rescan everything. You have just an ever-growing volume of data, and it's interesting to deal with all those problems and look at all this and get something useful out of it at the end of it.
Yeah,
I don't know if
and
that
useful.
Makes sense, but...
No, it does, because useful depends also on the receiver of that knowledge. So in Broadcom, they want to make sure that our latest versions are all up to date. We know the triage status. We know where we are with the vulnerabilities. We have actually internal policy requirements we have to meet for the latest releases. But our customers aren't always on the latest release. They might be on prior versions that maybe even go back to pre-versions that are not fully supported. And as Nishad mentioned, we have a lot of data. We go back to, I think, version 2.10 or earlier of all the data we have on Cloud Foundry. And with that, we are scanning those every day. We're still scanning those SBOMs, because if customers are using it, we need to have an answer of whether the vulnerabilities today, not 4 years ago or 5 years ago. So it's not a matter of just having the data, but also acting on that data every single day. And that data set's growing every single day too. So it really is an interesting subset of large data processing.
And I do want to bring in a comment from Findsy
Oh, yeah.
here, right? And this kind of goes back to what you were talking about, especially with like the Tomcat. Hey, we took a look at it, we did this triage, and guess what? It's not really that critical on the platform because of how the platform works, right? This
Mhm.
is a platform superpower that I don't think we lost David, that we don't talk about enough. So Nishad, this is all on you until David gets back. But this is a superpower of the platform that we talk about that we don't talk about enough is how the platform is fairly secure, but you still got to consider the layers of that. Okay, let's take Log4j for instance. When that hit, you know, we didn't really have a problem with that at the platform level. We patched it because it needed to be patched, but it wasn't really an issue really at the platform level. But you still had to take that down to the application level. Just because you see the platform may not have the issues, there's still an investigation that got to go into the applications that are running on that platform.
Yeah. And I think Cloud Foundry especially is kind of interesting because the applications themselves are an intersection of the application, what the developer builds, and whatever the platform provides. So like because of build packs, like they introduce, like in theory, they introduce part of a vulnerability service. Like it's not anything like if the developer was not using build packs, they'd have to do it themselves, and it would probably be a much worse situation. Sometimes the fix for a vulnerability isn't to update the app; it's actually to just update your build pack and restage everything, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's
I think that's one of the things.
a key developer experience versus you could just do like a restage to get the new build pack, and then versus now I have to go manually do this myself and figure that out, right?
Yep, and an ability to do one to many. So if you've got a lot of Java applications out there and you can fix that in the build pack, that allows you to hit multiple teams, secure those apps versus each team having to do that individually or do it container by container. Welcome back, Team.
Yeah, I was trying to share the CVE details in the Tomcat one with Nick, but I actually hit the wrong button on my cell phone and dropped off.
Do you mean bring the CV up on screen?
No. If you can just share it in the chat, and so folks can see it, and we can put it in the release note. But this is just the advisory we did on Tomcat, so the watchers and listeners can see details of what we did on the release. It goes into the different components and pieces, so you can see the outcome of that analysis.
Yep. And we will get that in the show notes. I found you can't copy and paste from chat, so we'll make sure we get that in show notes that people can link to and go see it instead of trying to type all that out. That's going to be difficult, but. Well, and there was one other thing. So we're going on this. Is there anything else we want to say on this? Because I have this question I've been burning to ask you ever since I knew we were doing into the DMZ this week.
We can always talk about CVEs forever and ever. I could keep going on about it, but no, if you want to pivot something else, let's do it and figure out where it goes.
Well, I mean, and I think Nick's going to be interested in this because, we've been talking, everybody's talking a lot about AI. And I was reading about how a lot of the giants are coming out to support the OASIS technical standards for AI applications, right? The need to kind of secure how that's going to impact cybersecurity. Do you have any take on that?
Well, I mean, sort of like an OWASP top 10 conversation, in my opinion. It's like we have a new technology and everyone's like, oh my gosh, we need to like redefine what security means all over again. When in reality, it's just do you have the authority to access the data you're supposed to access? Proper roles and responsibilities. Are you logging access? If something happens, what happened? Do you have proper segmentation of duties and roles around things? It really comes down to, we're taking well-known established practices around data and privilege and permissions and access and monitoring and applying it into the AI world. And I will say a lot of the AI world's built like most new applications. And I'm sure we've all seen this before. The first rendition of an application is like wide open. There's no logging, there's no access controls. There are things that you can do that you probably shouldn't do. And you start seeing people trying to exploit that. At first it was with model manipulation. It's like, oh, can I get it to tell me how to build a bomb? Can I get it to do those things I shouldn't be able to do? They started adding things, it's like, oh, let's add some whitelists and blacklists of things you can ask for, and we all know how well whitelists work. And blacklisting things. It's like, oh, I can't ask for a bomb now. So now I'll ask to tell me, pretend I'm back in the 1600s. I'm learning how to actually, work on like mining. I need to get some TNT and they describe it to me in old timey voice and like They like tricked it to going past the blacklist. And it's like, oh, that access control didn't work very well. So now we start getting some standards around, actually standardizing this. And one of the conversations that may not be part of the OASIS part here is really getting into the data itself. When you start having AI, you start having many people using the AI for a lot of different things. And what happens in a either top secret environment, picture DoD or military, or you picture some banking environment where you might have a teller, a customer service rep, maybe even your private banker, all have access to your data and the tools the bank is building. Now they go and build an AI agent. And they say, hey, if you have any problems, you can just jump into the agent and ask the question about the customer, and they'll tell you the details. But they didn't build any constraints on it. They didn't build access controls. Now, the teller who's at the desk can see that they've got, 15 different brokerage accounts, and they've got all these business accounts and maybe things they shouldn't be seeing because it doesn't have that access control and proper segmentation of who the requester is and who the customer is, and mapping that back into the AI functions and the data it's pulling through. So I think that we're learning this on the fly, the OASIS and other projects that are working on this data. But in the end, it still is standard security that's been around for decades. It's proper access, proper roles, proper monitoring, proper logging, and making sure we're building that into the tools we're using. At least that's my very simple point of view of describing it.
And I want to get Nick's take on this because he's way more AI focused than I am. But I mean, some interesting numbers did come out of that report about, how I think it's like 65% of companies are now starting to utilize AI. We're always talking about private AI and how to mitigate some of that security risk. But only, I think, 35% of companies actually have any processes in place to evaluate either their own AI or AI that they're using, which is, a lot of these big tech companies are feeling it's a risk. Nick, I mean, do you have a take on this? Because this is blowing up like a rocket, but it seems like we're not really thinking about security as part of this, except for what we talk about with private.
Yeah, well, I think obviously, public versus private is one thing, but then I think that's kind of where coming into the platform play helps craft that story, because there are just things that were built within Cloud Foundry per se to help secure some of these things. At least we're talking, we've done a lot of stuff with MCP clients and servers, and we're starting to see MCP servers be deployed. Well, maybe can we put Spring Cloud Gateway in front of that and do access control that way, and then things of that nature to help use some of these existing tooling where these are really just still microservices talking to each other, and they act a little bit differently and do a little bit different things, but you can use some of the the security that's been out there for a while within an app platform and to help to mitigate some of that risk or help control some of those access controls. And then obviously even was it last week, right, we were doing where Brian had Libre chat up, and we're using some of the CF Kaizen, and Brian had a collection of MCP agents in Libre chat, but he was even doing proper assignments of this agent can start or stop the app, but then if you want to do an org administrator level role, that's going to another agent, right? So it's RBAC with the level of agents of what you want each agent to do. So you start thinking about that type of stuff as well. So, I mean, I think we're still relatively scratching the surface here on some of these things, as it's as DMC pointed out, the first version of this is wide open, and we're whoa, we should probably rein that back in, so to speak. But yeah, it's just the normal kind of tech adoption cycle, I think, in some cases.
The way if I'm talking to anybody about AI, the way I want to really bring it up is, remember AI, the different kinds of AI first. Let's make sure we're addressing the proper thing they're talking about. I'm hugely a fan of machine learning and having machines process, petabytes, exabytes of data and help you analyze and work through that, because it's just too much data. We need tools to help us with that. I love the fact that we have natural language, the ability to talk to a computer. We could go back and remake that Star Trek movie where Scotty's trying to talk to the computer. He can actually talk to the computer now. We always wanted to be able to talk to the computer. Now he could talk to the computer. He could ask for his transparent aluminum. And he'd probably end up getting some sort of polyester or something weird, because again, it's going to hallucinate and I have no idea what he's talking about. But the real interesting thing comes in is we're making a lot of AI agents. And we have to remember those agents are effectively people with access to enormous amounts of data they can just regurgitate on a whim. And that means we have to take a lot of those controls we built, again, historically in the past. How do we apply that to an agent that's doing things on its own, but allow it to still function for the role it needs to have? And it might come up with something at 2 a.m. that a control is going to block and it's going to do something weird. How do we default to allowing the customer to get the data they need, but not default to sharing data they don't need to have? And Nick, I like your idea of the gateway in front of it, but that just allows who can get to it, not what it can do. That's going to have to be in the AI itself or in the data model. And we look at things, you look at Greenplum or any of these large databases that we have that are in the back end for some of these things. What are we doing for tagging that data? How are we actually able to say this data says top secret classified can only be accessed by users or customers of this role? And how do we apply those tags back to the AI? And how do we put the governance around those pieces?
Interesting. Are you basically proposing what sounds like role level? Like Postgres already has something called role level security, right? Are you proposing something like that, but for vector embeddings instead?
I think there's already starting of tagging in vectors. So I think that the beginning of that is already starting to be out there. I've not done enough AI development to really lean into it a lot, but my gut is telling me that's going to be needed. We need some way to have the AI say, I need to work with this data. Here's the level I have access to, and have the database help enforce that through the relationship because people are not part of it.
Well, I mean, and to tie this back to what our original conversation was, you've got this possibility. You're talking about how much data you had to go through, Nishad, to do some of the triage. This is a place where AI, I think, would provide enormous benefit if you can get it trained right. But the inverse of that is you got to make sure that you're securing it so somebody can't go ask the AI, what can I exploit here, right? Based on what you know about CVEs and the code that's out there. So though we're kind of seeing both sides of this, and where it can help the security side, but it can also expose the security side if you're not careful with it.
So I don't know if we want to say anything, but there's actually a really cool. I'll find it offline and share it with you. Also, you can share it with your watchers. But I saw something on a podcast last week about an AI security company that's able to do chain-based attacking. So it can actually do exactly what you just said. It says, I got all the details of vulnerabilities. And sometimes we're so focused on the criticals and highs, we're like, oh, there's so many mediums and low, but they're mediums and low. They're not really an issue. But you can chain 3 or 4 mediums together and get an exploit just as good as a critical. So with AI, you can actually do that analysis. You get that, it's sort of like, Dr. Strange and he's like looking at all these different paths of like the different ways you can try to, to win, the Infinity War. It just sat there and like going through all the different paths. That's what AI is doing. It can run through hundreds of thousands of scenarios and then come back and say, oh, here's the attack chain I found. There's actually AI companies in the security space working on that attack chain. The attack chain. Gosh, my speech is bad today too. But the attack chain analysis of complex CVEs in these complex systems and applications, and it's really a fascinating field.
Well, you could say the threat actors are probably doing that too. So you got to have the good guys using the same tooling, right, to stay on the same level.
I almost like this actually make. I actually like one of the biggest things with that Tomcat vulnerability, David, was it basically disrupted so many different teams having to answer questions, not in a bad way, but it had to happen. You basically had to go, we've picked up potentially vulnerable components here. Can you go actually look at it and tell me what's going on? It would be really cool if somehow you can get an agent to actually do that analysis for you. To just it would save so many people so much time if you could literally just say, this is the source code for this repo. Can you please go check it and see if this vulnerability applies?
100%.
If y'all are ever on any customer calls with me back, from Pivotal forward, we have a partner contrast security that I love the idea that it's not AI based, but it does say, Nishad, you've been part of these conversations on many triage scenarios we've had. Sometimes like Tomcat one, it's very straightforward. Do you have the X, Y, and Z configuration? Other times it's like, well, we have a libxml vulnerability, but it's only on this one parsing function. The rest of libxml is fine. Then you have to actually go into the code and say, am I using this function? And that's where contrast was really good for doing it. It actually says, oh, this one library, like log4j, if you're not using that one function, your code can't call the vulnerable library. So Nishad, I would definitely be interested in seeing how we could actually do some of our AI research around that. It'd be a really interesting side project we could look at. How do we actually take something that has the complexity of a vulnerability, and take the data we have, analyze it, and look at our usage patterns. How do we actually go from an SBOM to a mapping of the relationship between SBOMs and the execution path within the libraries and functions of that SBOM? So it's more of an application mapping function, which would be an interesting set of metadata, I think, to add to it.
Yeah, like you can sort of do this with static analysis tools, but I don't actually know any tool that goes back after the, like, I don't know anyone who's like, here, we released this like 5 years ago. Can you go recheck it for this vulnerability? Like, that's not a thing I've ever heard of anyone doing. That's basically what we're proposing here.
Yeah, I think, this goes back to something that me and Nick have talked about quite a bit when we start looking at the upkeep of things like agentic AI. Back to David's point, right? DMZ said this. They become virtual workers. Everybody's going to become kind of a CEO of their own little company. And we're going to have, I imagine that you've probably got security teams working on this right now to say, you're absolutely right, Nishad. Nobody's looking at old code, but I could have my virtual employees start doing that for me, and they never get tired. They never have to take breaks. But again, you also got to look again to the inverse of that to say, the threat actors are out there doing the same thing, saying, hey, go look at some of this stuff and tell me where I'm missing something that I could possibly exploit. It's like a never-ending circle. All good things are going to come from bad things, and all bad things are going to lead to good things, right?
We will not be bored for the near future or the long-term future. I think there's a lot of work to be done here. And I think back to what Nishad was saying, though, I think one of the biggest things that I would love to see as a way for us to get out of that triage workflow. If we can do anything to reduce the amount of time developers spend on just analyzing a vulnerability and saying, am I vulnerable or not to this? And then how do I patch up to it? Tying that into, App Advisor, things we can do to actually help do those upgrades. But the analysis part, we're not doing that in our work right now. We're just doing that triage work of like, here's a bunch of vulnerabilities, create tickets, create workflows, create things that the development teams can then work backwards to do their triage work and analysis on it. But anything we could do to either AI or scripting or tying, reducing that workload is going to be humongously beneficial. And I think it'll have an exponential amount of support it could have across not just our own work within the products we have, but the customers we have and the apps that they build. So I'd love to see the tool, more than us taking our tools to help emphasize our own platforms, but extend them in a way that allow our customers to then leverage those same set of tools on what they built on our platforms.
Yeah, because I remember, like, if you go back to that example in Log4j, it's like, yeah, the platform, is fine and everything, but like, again, you still have to check all the app level dependencies, and just saying, like, if the platform can say, all right, I know all these things, but then I can also scan everything running on me and say, we need to check out these 3 apps too, like, and then alert to developer level, like, hey, you really should check out, we think there's a problem here. Like, that would be, I think, the dream state, right?
I want to add on to that also. If you look at when you get the release, the notes from the today's episode, and you get the vulnerability for Tomcat, or you can just Google it out there if you're curious. There's also people put together a signature. So one of the things you want to do is, like, even when Log4j came out, one of the immediate things we did after we had a patch, a couple hours after it came out, we had a patch out. But the next step we did is, how do we know if someone's been compromised? How do we know if someone had this run against them? And you have to look at the analysis of all of the event logs coming out of all the systems that are infected. So the ability to not just detect and find and remediate, but also go back through all the event logs. And y'all know how much logs Cloud Foundry makes. It makes a lot of logs. How do we go back through those logs and say, we saw someone attempt to use this exploit on this service at this time, and we can then tie it together? Was that vulnerability known? That was it not known? Were there actors that had this vulnerability before it was public? So there's a lot of things that, not just on patching and understanding, but I mentioned at the very beginning of our conversation that I want to get to a point where we're actually able to start doing the real risk analysis. Were we compromised? Were we at risk? Was there actually something to be worried about? So we can then start focusing on the real risk to our business, not necessarily just the CVE patching.
And I think that's
And
interesting.
AI would be great for that.
Yeah, I think that's interesting as well, because you're talking about, hey, we want to do these things as well. I'm going to do something that may be an unpopular opinion. At what point do you start taking on too much load onto a platform, right? Is it a platform for running workloads? Is it a platform for, enhancing or detecting security issues? Do you try to do all things? I'm a firm believer in something that tries to do everything is a master at none. Where do you break that line up between, who runs the platform, who does the security?
Well, an interesting concept I would love to see is imagine if you had a foundation that coordinated other foundations. Because very, large companies are not going to have one foundation on everything. They're going to always have multiple foundations. So what if you had your control plane foundation that provided this base level? Here's your mapping of all your versions of all the SBOMs of all the things, and we have this dashboard that can help you understand your platform status. And then naturally we have Spring Cloud data flow. We can integrate with our logging. We actually have parsing of things. So I think there's things that if I'm running a platform that is meant to run applications, all of those things the platform does, I should not necessarily. The platform engineer is one user of the system. The developers are, their business units who use those applications are also users. And I will also throw out that some of the banks and other DoD and other folks we're working with, their security and governance teams are also users of the system. Now they have their own security tools. We want to enhance those tools with the Tanzu answer toward them. But the idea here is it's not going to be a platform of everything, but it will provide the knowledge and details of what's running on it. So if someone's running something built from Tanzu components, they should expect to get answers from Tanzu of those components in easy to consume method around their platforms.
No, I think that's a great
go back to our
point.
theme. CVEs, and CVEs aren't the issue here. It's a life cycle. It's how do we get to a point of having continuously knowledge of what is there, what the risks are, how do we move around it, how do we protect it, and it's never ending. So we need to have a way for actually looking at both the hero report, but then down to the details of what, like Nishad works in. Someone will always want to get down to the details and dig through that massive amount of data, even if we give them a dashboard. So we got to find ways of getting customers what they need.
Well, it's like it's always defense in depth, right? So like if whatever the platform can do to help this story, but then there's always other stories too and other layers to be mindful of. Like I don't know, like maybe even scan code before you even ship it, right? That type of thing. And there's the pipelines above the platform, right?
And we've got great partners. Right? We've got partners on a lot of that. Inside the Cloud Foundry world, we have partners. The Qualys, the Aquas, the CrowdStrikes. All of those security companies, and we're not looking to replace them. But they don't have the context. If they see, as Nishad mentioned, they will only see things once they're publicly in the databases. So even more than that, they don't know the nuances of how we or our customers have built things from it. So just because you have Tomcat, like this one Tomcat thing, doesn't mean you're deploying it in a way that's vulnerable. So a scanner will see Tomcat throughout Cloud Foundry and go, "Oh my God, you're vulnerable." But reality is when you look at the data and you look at the configurations, it's not configured in a way that makes it vulnerable. So that context in the answer from the teams who have built from both the Tanzu world, with the Cloud Foundry world, or our customers who built their own applications, that context and metadata is extremely important to the reality of the risk.
I really like the way that you just said that, DMZ, because you're not talking about this coming into Cloud Foundry having its own security portion. If I heard you right, what I heard you say was we'll use Cloud Foundry, but applications, platforms as a whole, need to be able to describe themselves so that the other tools can realize what it's saying. So we know the applications that are running on Cloud Foundry. We should be able to tell you if this application is doing something that is out of the norm and trigger that. And then the security tools should be able to take that information that we provide and reflect on it. Am I hearing you right? Because if it is, that's awesome. I like that idea.
It's Tanzu enhanced data that it becomes actionable so it's not just like wildly swinging a bat in the dark. We're giving you a little light to see what we can see from the infrastructure and pieces you're consuming from us of how do you build from that your security postures.
Yep. And I think with the emergence and the growth of AI, that's something that could be a real possibility for every application that runs out there or every platform. I won't say every application, but be able to tell other systems what I'm doing and where I think something may be out of norm for me, and then let them handle that. Am I hearing you right?
Well, I've been yes, in many ways, and Nishad, don't worry, we will definitely be circling back on that because I have a lot of interesting things. We're probably gonna bring a Deeb, and y'all have had a Deeb on here, haven't you? I'm not sure.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yes. So we'll probably see if we can rope him in and see his thoughts on how we can apply some of the AI tools that we've been building into some of this data set that Nishad's been working on and see how can we help make this easier. It's a long road though. We're not gonna, Nishad, don't worry, we're not gonna try to have it done in the next month. You got a little bit of time to think about it.
Yeah, they're going to give you a month and a half.
We just need Nishad to have 1,000 AI agents under his disposal, and they can start, building everything all at once.
We need this tomorrow, by the way.
Yeah.
That's right. And in case anybody didn't hear it, DMZ just threw down the gauntlet for Tanzu to say this is what we got to do, and the shots need to get it done not in the next month and a half. No pressure.
That's your timeline.
Yeah. I love this conversation. This was a great conversation. It really was. I mean, exploring all the different, how AI, how workloads, how application development teams, they intersect in so many different ways. And to Nick's point, we're just scratching the surface of what we may be able to do with some of this functionality that's coming up.
Yeah.
It's going to be exciting next couple of years. Definitely.
Yep. I agree. Yep.
All right. Well, I mean, we are at the top of the hour. It's been a very kind of wild ride with this technical issues, but I think we got through it all. Do we have any closing thoughts? Any last thoughts for our listeners, guests?
Just if you're in or around the Charlotte area, come to B-Sides next weekend. Let's meet. Happy to continue the conversation there, or just reach out online. Happy to continue at any point, because this is, as y'all know, this is what I live in. This is exciting to me, so I definitely want to share with anybody who wants to talk about it.
Nishad, anything from you?
Oh, security is hard. ...
100%.
Yes.
Yep, I agree. I will say we got KubeCon EU coming up. I'll be out there if anybody's out at KubeCon in London. Stop by and say hi. And then we've got Cloud Foundry Day coming up. So
yeah,
come see the show live.
Yeah, well, yeah. If you want to see us live, we'll be there with our friends, and come check us out. And I say security is hard, ... but y'all are working on making it easier, right? You gotta
more digestible, so you can focus.
Yeah.
My goal is to not worry about the individual CVEs. We don't need to be afraid of them. We need to have knowledge about them and really focus on the business risk.
Very cool. Well, I'll do a shameless plug.
Paying somebody else to take care of it for you, right? That's what it boils down to.
Well, I like that. I would
like
prefer
that as well.
Yeah.
Yep.
Especially
if those people are virtual.
Yeah.
I want to be my own little CEO. Yeah. And I would like to say, Rajan, sorry we couldn't get you on. Sorry we had issues.
Yeah.
I would have loved to have heard from you. So maybe next time, bud. Shameless plug.
Shameless plug. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I still have this ginormous pillow that barely fits on the screen, but I think this is the best that I've gotten on camera here. You should like and subscribe.
Yeah, that works.
Foundry Weekly, right? It's just
Foundryweekly.com. Come look us up on LinkedIn. Reach out to me, Nick, DMZ, Nishad. Okay, if we put your LinkedIn and stuff up on the show notes so they can reach out to you that way as well? Awesome. So, got questions? Come reach out to one or two or all of us if you need to. But don't forget to check out all the places where you can find Cloud Foundry Weekly.
Perfect. I guess without that further ado, we'll end the show with a CF bye. Right? 3, 2, 1. CF bye.
Bye.